Thanking Neil and Kevin and Horizons for the invitation. And I want to also thank Ellen Spiro for agreeing to participate today with me. I want to also thank Clancy Kavanagh, who is my co-editor in several books, which I will talk about here. I also want to thank my father because when I was 11 years old, he got a scholarship to study 1 year in New York. And so I attended public school 144 in Queens, and that's where I learned English. And my father is just this really nice guy, and it's nice to be back in New York at the age of 45, 30 years after that experience. Neil asked me to talk a little bit about my trajectory, because he says this is a 10-year gathering, so it has a kind of review or balanced touch to it. And he asked me to do a kind of overview of my trajectory, which I find a challenge because I have gone in different directions. So this presentation is a little dispersed, but it has a project. Don't worry, if you follow me and just me and not a PowerPoint, that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my trajectory, what have I done following news requests. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about ayahuasca globalization or expansion internationalization, which is one of the topics that I wrote about. It's also the topic of my PhD. And then in the third part, I'm going to talk a little bit about ayahuasca and health, and ayahuasca and the scientific field of research, and my contribution to this area as well. And then in the second part, Ellen will show a sample of a work in progress that we are collaborating on. So we are splitting our presentation. So about my trajectory, it has been a mix of, let's say, 4 things. The first one is scientific research. So I have dedicated myself to writing and publishing and editing books. I have a kind of editorial talent, and I'm kind of compulsive about doing books. I always like to say that ayahuasca is not addictive, but scientific research about ayahuasca is addictive. I have published 18 books by now since he read, and now other books are out. These books have combined different areas, and as I said, I'm going to give 2 appetizers of the whole thing, so you can have go home with some of those ideas in my writings. The other part is obviously my personal interest. So I started to study ayahuasca because I drank ayahuasca and I was fascinated by ayahuasca. Ayahuasca touched my heart, touched my soul. I had an inspiration to study ayahuasca. So a big part of my story is drinking ayahuasca and thinking about ayahuasca, which for me do not clash but combine. And people always try to think of this as kind of things that are conflictive or disputing. I think they are each one, complementary to the others. And as an anthropologist, I don't find personal experience to be a bias. On the contrary, I find a privilege to be able to draw on my own experience, and that help build my knowledge and my research. I know it's easier for anthropologists to do those claims publicly. Also for a Brazilian one, I don't have a license to lose, and I'm not in the USA. So I'm having the pleasure to share this very openly with you, and you can be jealous of me. But I also do encourage my colleagues to take the same stand. And I think that, spaces like this are ways to advance this debate, because this is related to the next topic that the glimpse of my general presentation, which is another part of my activities have been a large political activism. So I identify myself as an activist. I'm an anti-prohibitionist activist. I'm in favor of a large drug reform, and I think it's part of the obligations of the researchers to take a political stand on the topics they study. The way I see it is that drug users specifically psychedelic users are a minority. So minorities need to be protected with special rights. It doesn't matter that it's not considered enough of a social problem, it's not involved in big health issues or violence or border issues, geographic tensions, military complexes as other drugs, but it's still a legitimate dimension, and it's still a legitimate worry. So the way I like to understand this is, if you're an anthropologist and you study indigenous populations, it's your duty to defend indigenous territories. If you're an anthropologist and you study Afro-American or Afro-Brazilian populations, it's part of your research agenda. It's your duty to fight against racism and discrimination. If you study women or gender issues, it's your duty to support the rights of women and the rights of LGBT populations to have autonomy over their choices and their bodies. The same thing, I think, if you study drug users, you need to protect the rights of the drug users. So I do not think that I think that the fight against criminalization is part of the research agenda of a person that is involved in this field. And I have taken this very openly, and I encourage also my colleagues to do the same. Regarding the last point, I kind of made a division which is a little, arbitrary, between political activism and what I'm calling here, for the purposes of today, as community activism. Perhaps this is just a fancy way to cover up the fact that I'm kind of feisty and troublemaker. So I have engaged in many controversies, a lot of them. I have a kind of a CV of controversies. But I believe that it's just our obligation to engage in the field as well, because the way I see it is also like that. Either we control ourselves, or the government or authorities or other external agencies will come and control. So I think it's part of the development of the ayahuasca field to sort of cool to pray for the converted, huh? It's part of the ayahuasca field to, I think, we have this challenge. There's so many things going on, and it's part of what I'm calling here cultural and informal controls. It's the means that people, traditions, populations, groups, certain territories have rules and parameters of what is right and wrong use and what is ethical and unethical. And I have been engaged in spreading, trying to spread those types of controls and standards. So that's a little bit about my trajectory. As I said, this is a real general presentation. And the second topic I'm going to talk is about ayahuasca tourism. The title of my PhD is Ayahuasca Mamancuna Merci Beaucoup, on the internationalization and diversification of Peruvian ayahuasca vegetalismo. I have also published 2 books that I want to recommend. That is Ayahuasca Shamanism in the Amazon and Beyond. I think that this is one of the greatest ever on ayahuasca, modestly. It's a collection, and it's by Oxford University Press, and this one is just out now, The World Ayahuasca Diaspora, Reinventions and Controversies. So again, I'm not going to talk about my PhD in 6 minutes, but I just want to put like 3 ideas out there so you have a contribution from me from today in this very short presentation. The main point, and everybody's all the time asking, is like, all this expansion, all this globalization, all this interest, all this media, all this pop, all these things in TV, how is this affecting the Indians? Is this authentic? Is this a big perversion? Is this right or wrong? Is this colonization? Are we invading other territories? Is the Amazon the last frontier that everybody wants to populate and colonize? How do you see it? So it's a big question. It's kind of complicated to say it's bad, it's right or wrong. My kind of perspective, it's happening anyway. So I think we have to try to do it in the best way possible and not just boycott it or criticize it. Although I think that critical thinking is fundamental. As I said, I'm engaged in trying to somehow influence the direction of this development. And the main ideas that I want to put out there, the first one is to deconstruct a notion of a linear narrative about ayahuasca. So what is the evolutionistic classic basic narrative? Ayahuasca was used by the Indians inside the forest, then there was colonization, then the mestizo people started to use it, and then the non-indigenous people started to use it, and then it globalized, and it went to the New Age movement, and it went to places like New York and São Paulo and Europe, and this is how things evolved. So there you had something authentic and original, and now you have something mixed and impure. This narrative doesn't stick to historical facts about ayahuasca, because the history of ayahuasca is that it has been always mixed and always hybrid. There is not such a linear evolution of ayahuasca practices. A lot of the things that we think are traditional are in fact importations from the city back into the forest. So a lot of what we know as vegetalismo, which became to be the representation of traditional ayahuasca practices, most likely was born in riverine cities with colonization in the Amazon, and then imported back to the forests, to indigenous populations and to shamans. So when sometimes we go and we see a shaman doing certain practices, we think that that is a result of this linear evolution, but that's not the case. And in fact, the case is the contrary, is that he is also a product of this expansion. For example, the word chacrona, it doesn't exist, the leaf of ayahuasca doesn't exist in some indigenous tongues, because it just exists in Spanish. It was not used traditionally. People like the Machigengas learned the use of ayahuasca in the 50s, 60s with missionaries. Other indigenous groups are learning about the use of ayahuasca right now. So, for example, the Guarani Indians, they started using ayahuasca just recently, and they learned it with the mestizo people, with the Santo Daime people, with the Red Path people. Ayahuasca is very related to this idea of new ethnic emergencies, so groups that are reinventing themselves as ayahuasca users appeared recently. I think that my whole PhD and these books are questioning this idea of authenticity, that Amazonia has been something fixed and staying in somewhere historical without change. What we're trying to say is that shamanism is less about a fixed content, essence, a permanent content, but about a way to relate things between each other. And I think that a lot of the appeal of ayahuasca to people like us is that it somehow, it incarnates the idea of some kind of quintessential indigenous identity. It represents this kind of pan-indigenous identity. The people that are doing ayahuasca always try to link themselves to some kind of indigenous tradition or leader. Ayahuasca's popularity is associated with a double connection with the Amazon, with its wild nature, the spiritual and ecological reserve of the world, and to the Amerindian, who represent the guardians of a primordial wisdom and the incarnation of an ecological ideal. It's ayahuasca manages to condense these images and convert them into a consumable substance. I think that a lot of ayahuasca's appeal beyond its relation to indigeneity is because ayahuasca is a privileged means of establishing communications, of establishing relationships. It's a privileged means with ties of all categories of others. And I'm going to read here a quote by Oscar, who is writing the foreword of our book. Ayahuasca used by forest peoples is mostly about sociality, a negotiation among human and non-human companions and neighbors, an activity that establishes networks, sometimes precarious, between kins and affins, masters and apprentices, brothers-in-law, animal spirits and the dead, or battleground between rival shamans to connect with potential allies and also with probable enemies. So I think that part of the appeal of ayahuasca is this relational ability, which is the ability to communicate, to establish relations, to communicate with authority, with the other. I think a lot of what we can understand ayahuasca and this expansion, there are two different opposite processes. One is a process of retraditionalization or hyper-traditionalization, of kind of wanting to purify everything that is non-indigenous or Christian from ayahuasca traditions. So this is very strong in the expansion of ayahuasca, this kind of hyper-reality, hyper-reality, where you want to be more tradition than the traditional. For example, the idea that you ritualize ayahuasca preparation, which traditionally is not so ritualized. This is one whole way to look at it. The other is the processes of reinvention and recreation, transformation, and so forth. So I have not been able to cover the third part of what I was planning to talk, which is about a little bit about ayahuasca and biomedical research. I want to respect the time of Ellen, but we can pick up on those things on the second part. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, MAPS, Rick Doblin, Brad Burge, and all these other wonderful people. I'm completely new to this community, but meeting so many great people, and appreciate you letting me stand up here. I met Bia about a year ago, when I was very curious about the subject of different sacred plants and healing, and sort of gravitated to her as somebody sort of that I could learn from on a personal level about these things. And then soon after we met, we embarked on a project together, a film project, with the help of a guy named Robert Barnhart, who I want to make a plug for his film called A New Understanding, The Science of Psilocybin, which, you know, as a total newbie in this area, that film kind of gave me an understanding of the therapeutic uses of psilocybin, ayahuasca, etc. So he launched Bia and I off on a little adventure, and you're about to just see a little sneak preview. I don't normally show films that are not complete, and the purpose of this is to get your input. So I'm gonna hopefully have some time afterwards to talk to you guys outside, but right now it's looking like what we're doing is an episodic series with Bia as our guide. And in order to do that, we have to know who she is. So she's taught me so much in this last year, I can't say, but one of the things I've gotten is a little dose of her cynicism towards the whole field, and the idea that somebody goes down to Peru, they drink ayahuasca, and the next thing you know, they're a shaman and leading ceremonies in Berkeley and all over the country. There's another thing going on with documentaries, in that people go down there, they drink ayahuasca, and then they become an expert and make a documentary. So I just want to say that that's not me. I'm going into this, very with a completely open mind, and it's been an amazing journey, and I don't know how to say it without using the cliche of self-healing, but that's actually what it's been for me. So let's just show this, and hopefully we'll have some time for a little Q&A.
We're gonna make time now for Q&A.
So the part about help us make this film, we are looking to hire a really great editor and sound designer, but if anybody wants to come on board as a producer, an executive producer, you'd be in great company, and we'd love to have you.
I'm sure you'll find more skilled and detailed feedback from others. I can just say myself, I'm very much looking forward to seeing this when it comes out, so thank you for that work you're doing. Bia, I just wanted to see if you'd be interested in giving us a little bit of the biomedical stuff that you weren't able to get into in your presentation.
I think what I wanted to stress is that I think there's lots of prejudice, society at large against these practices, but also within our research communities, biomedical people frequently totally ignore what social scientists are doing, and vice versa. Social scientists like to depict biomedical research as this horrible, reductionistic, fragmented form of knowledge. And a lot of what I've tried to do is this bridge between English and non-English speaking world, and North and South, and biomedical research and social sciences. And I guess my main message for about biomedical research is I really encourage this kind of knowledge, and I am a pluralist, and I'm in favor of all kinds of research, and I support widely the development of our field. I don't share the perspective of a lot of colleagues or indigenous people that, you know, studying substances in a laboratory is a sacrilege, and what is being done is a big perversion and lack of respect of traditional cultures and forms of knowledge. But on the other side, I think that we really can't take the scientific findings about about the use of these substances as the only truth or the truth. I think we have to be very aware of the danger of medicalizing the uses of psychedelics and thinking that only medical knowledge is legitimate or more important. Having all kinds of you know, new sets of parameters that would be the only monopoly over the means, the appropriate means. I think it's very important to advance the research on the therapeutic potentials. I think it's very important to advance the idea that ayahuasca and mushrooms and iboga and other substances are medicines and have therapeutic potentials, but I think we need to do critical thinking about what biomedical research is. So the main question is, do the results from the lab translate immediately into the experience of what people are doing out there in the real world? So first of all, in the case of ayahuasca, if you work with freeze-dried ayahuasca, which is lyophilized ayahuasca, that is just a capsule without water, you're actually not using ayahuasca. You're using a substance that you produced for your research. And you're using a research setting that doesn't mirror any reality on how people are using ayahuasca, because the first thing is that you screen your participants and eliminate people with a lot of conditions, and sometimes only take people that are not naive. So I think that the results of this research, they are a specific mode of knowledge and reality. They are not the reality and the only reality. And I think it's a fine line, because we want to advance the understanding and legitimacy of these plants and their uses. But on the other side, if we are only looking at them through our lenses, which is a major biomedical or legal categories, we're perhaps losing something along the way, which is trying to understand how these things are used by the people who knew them originally. And I think that the very idea of plant spirit is a great idea, because it's the idea that it's a spirit, a being that has some kind of agency or intentionality or wish or maybe jealousy or little idiosyncrasies that you have to relate to that plant spirit and learn from it and obey and have discipline and follow those teachings, and perhaps you learn things. So the idea of plant spirit goes much beyond this general categories to which we classify drugs, either as religious sacrament, medicine, recreational. The way traditional people use these plants implode the categories that we have. They reorganize, they set out in a different way the frameworks that we have to understand reality. So looking and taking indigenous people seriously in their own terms, I think is really fascinating and revolutionary.
Yes. The importance of the ayahuasca community controlling itself, or else the government will control us, and that maybe that could be done in somewhat informal cultural ways. Could you speak a little bit more about that, how you would see that, what that would look like? Gossips
and criticisms and little ayahuasca wars that go on daily, that we feel kind of overwhelmed and tired.
Ayahuasca wars, that's a new concept.
Yeah, they are. You know, when somebody sends out an email saying, this center in Peru is doing a horrible work, they're commercializing ayahuasca and they're creating a module for people to become curanderos in 5 lessons, and this is an absurd. And it's just this constant criticism. Somebody came to my center, he drank somewhere else and he's totally messed up and I really have to fix him up. and all these things that you just say, wow, why are people so engaged in this petty talk? But I think that in fact this kind of talk is doing some kind of control. That people, when they criticize and watch and comment other people's behaviors, it's a form of cultural control, of informal control. So basically informal and cultural controls is what people learn and teach, and that's what really matters. I like to give this example. If you go to an ayahuasca ceremony and the shaman goes to the restroom, you're not going to go there, steal the bottle and get a little bit and drink more because he's not looking. Well, maybe you do that once in your life and then you you regret and you won't do it again. So why aren't you doing that? It's because you learn that that's not something you should do. So learning the ways to do things, learning informally by the other one who tells you the stories, the folklore, the myths, the funny jokes, the anecdotal stuff, all those things that surround the ayahuasca culture, those are the cultural and informal controls. It's much more efficient that one person tells the other then you just, somewhere in some bureaucrat office in the middle of I don't know where, somebody issues in a piece of paper a resolution saying what is right and wrong. So this is what anthropologists call cultural and informal forms of control. And that's why I'm still an optimistic. Because I think that if you consider the huge expansion of ayahuasca all over the globe, well, not all over the globe, but I think in a country like the US, every city I could say, each weekend there are several ayahuasca ceremonies. A place like New York, maybe at least 20 or 30 circles. I think it could be going much worse. I think culture is still prevailing and it's able to reinvent, recreate, put parameters, put boundaries. And that is why we claim that these things have some sort of tradition and roots, because they are evolving as part of a larger cultural setting. That's the famous cultural setting that everybody says. Drugs is drug, the substance, the individual, and the setting. So let's take the setting seriously. And that is what I call cultural and informal means of control.
And it's so different this time. Please. It's so different this time than it was in the 60s when, hard drugs, chemicals were foisted on society. And ayahuasca is such a different way of bringing psychedelics, reintegrating them into society. So different than the electrocholic acid test, for example. It's just a whole different attitude. It's safe, it's beautiful, and it's not aggressive and confrontational. That wasn't a question, that was a comment. But I welcome your comments on that. Any other questions?
So could you tell us a bit more about the more traditional model of shamanic consumption of ayahuasca, where it's the shaman that ingests the substance rather than the person who is looking for the healing properties?
Yeah, so ayahuasca is considered among different settings frequently a diagnosed tool. So the shaman will take ayahuasca and see what kind of problem the person has and give the person certain medications. I think that the certain plants or diets or baths and things like that. I really enjoyed Stephen Ross talking here yesterday about future models where maybe therapists given psilocybin in therapeutic context, that they want to have these people have first-hand experience to know what people are feeling. I just want to throw this idea out there that I think it's fabulous, and I think that the kind of research that is being developed in the US and in that conferences like this are meeting places. I feel that these biomedical researchers are highly influenced by a shamanic sensibility, and I really appreciate that. So I think that we are really privileged in a time of history where this kind of knowledge really does circulate. And although I think that there is some reductionism not all aspects are acknowledged. I just want to recognize that a lot of this, that the contemporary research is very aware of the way that these substances came about and try to learn with the traditional settings, and want to encourage that path, and also want to say that I would like to collaborate in this kind of research design and give my input as an anthropologist. So sorry that I deviated a little from your question.
About spiritual and intellectual, and you don't see a difference, which I very much agree with. So I just wanted to ask, like, what is the connection maybe you felt with the natural sciences when you did ayahuasca, like math or physics? Did you have anything with that? Like, did you have some kind of realizations? I don't know.
No, really.
Okay, that's sorry.
Jessica Nielsen was thanking me for my mentorship, and is she here? I just wanted to tell her that when I read a paper and I see a bunch of tables, I kind of jump all of them. My mind is not very related to natural sciences, and I always think more about people and culture and tradition, but there's lots of reports of people connecting to the natural dimension, classic in the literature, but it's not my case so much.
I wanted to ask you a question about ayahuasca tourism that you mentioned, and I really appreciate what you said about this isn't something we should pass judgment on, it's something that's just happening. Can you talk more about what we can do to help that go into a constructive direction as opposed to a destructive direction?
I like to think more of then there is an essence of a tradition, like, you know, the correct way to do is this and that's the traditional, and I just think we have to think of basic, universal, ethical and responsible aspects. So things like the person who gives ayahuasca should be really trained and have more experience than the others. You shouldn't be taking this mixed with all kinds of other things. You should stay until the end of the ceremony. You shouldn't be advertising this as some kind of panacea that is going to save the person from all sorts of diseases. You shouldn't be making this too much of a commercial enterprise. There's been several initiatives of establishing guidelines or ethical principles on the proper ways to use ayahuasca, so there's some efforts out there, and I think that it's complicated to try to determine a kind of, you know, correct ritual and correct, even the idea of diet. Diet is super strong in the Peruvian tradition, but like in Colombia with yagé, which is very, very traditional, perhaps from even where ayahuasca came from, they don't have the idea of diet. So I think that it, you know, for us outsiders, it's more like thinking of certain general parameters that are important for an experience to be successful. Another aspect that I want to provoke you guys is that has been a lot. Everybody loves integration, and integration is the thing, and it's all this buzz around integration. I think the film shows, and it's implicit in the scenes. For these cultures, a lot of it has to do with secrecy and with not saying things. So traditionally, it would be considered kind of violent, kind of weird that you tell your visions or that you tell everybody what you saw. I think, to me, integration, I'm going to call it homework. When you take these plants, you gotta kind of know what you have to do. You know the shit that you have to take care of. You kind of know what it is about. So the integration, the way I see it, I'm not against people who do that, but for me, I'm sharing my experience. It's not going to a specialist and sitting there and talking about it, but it's doing your homework. And I also think doing it discreetly, preferably. I think if we want to look at traditional settings, that's a lot about it. You're not supposed to say where. Even they are saying that these plants are disappearing because of we make so much noise about it. So the Mazatecs say that the mushrooms are going somewhere remote and we can't find them anymore. The idea of peyote is that it hides itself to us, and ayahuasca, there's also starting to be a kind of shortage. So I think that one thing, to go back to your question about how to do it right, I think it's more action and more solid stuff and less blah blah and less talk about it. It's like doing things in a right way, and we all know what is right in our hearts. Yeah.
Join me in thanking these guys. Do your homework. Bia Labate, Spiro. Thank you guys so much.